the subjects, the feelings that come up in addressing these weighty matters are strong. And I'm very glad that we can gather in this way. And it's always my hope that the stirring of our imaginations in the company of one another be a positive stirring towards new understandings, new empathy, new companionship. So I will briefly introduce our speakers in the order of the program, and I will introduce each one before their paper. So allow me now to introduce our colleague, Roni Masel. Roni is Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature at UC Berkeley. Masel is currently completing a book manuscript titled Bad Readers, Misreading, Mistranslation, and Other Textual Malpractices in Hebrew and Yiddish. This work explores Jewish literatures in Eastern Europe from the perspective of reading and paraliteracy, nationalism, and dissent. A new project tentatively titled Race and Empire. Roni is studying the global and modern Yiddish culture and considers works of literature and philology to examine a globalizing Yiddish culture in the 20th century between Europe, North America, and South Africa. Please join me in welcoming Professor Masel.
So the title for my talk today is Don't Read This Book, Burn It, Misreading the Catastrophe, and Jewish Literary Modernity, and I'm not sure yet if it's Misreading the Catastrophe. Also, I'm thinking about Jewish Literary Modernity, or we're misreading Jewish Literary Modernity, and I'm sort of tending to the latter. So I'll start by saying that I do not know much about Moshe Aaron Lev, but I gather he was a passionate reader. He cared deeply about texts, about the truth, about the world, and he cared a lot when it came to the Russian Tsardom and to the later Romanovs, especially Tsar Nikolai II, whom he called the pig. And I encountered Moshe Aaron. If you don't recognize the name, that's because I don't know who he is. I encountered Moshe Aaron through a series of Yiddish inscriptions he left in a book, signing his name on the inner cover of a book thus. And you can see here, that's on the left. This book was read by Moshe Aaron Lev from Krinki, Grodno Gubernia, or Grodno province, now living here in Cricklewood, London. I found these inscriptions in a copy of Sefer Shevet Yehuda Shalem, or the Complete Scepter of Judah, printed by the famous Vilna Press, Almana Ve'achim Rom, the Widow and Brothers Rom, in 1904, and held in the collections of the National Library of Israel, although when Moshe Aaron read it, it belonged in the collection of a Jewish circulating library in London's East End. Despite its title that you see on the right, this version of Shevet Yehuda was far from complete. The volume is actually a patchwork of Yiddish translations and significant additions to, as well as omissions from, the 16th century Hebrew historiographic compilation Shevet Yehuda by the Iberian-born Shlomo ibn Verga, while the original work included accounts of anti-Jewish persecution from late antiquity to events in the author's own lifetime in the Iberian context. The 1904 Vilna edition included a Yiddish translation of another work entirely, the 17th century Hebrew chronicle Yeven Metzula, or Abyss of Despair, which narrates the tragic events of the 17th century Cossack uprising in Ukraine, led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And it is this part of the book, or the volume, that Moshe Aaron Lev cared most about, read most thoroughly, and vandalized most passionately. And I'll give you a few examples soon. Moshe Aaron's multiple inscriptions, which included swears and violent threats, as well as a sense of shared intimacy with other readers of that same library copy, informs my exploration today of the reading culture that evolved around works like the early modern Yeven Metzula, and that I argue have lingered into the 20th century, and thus they invite a renewed appreciation of modern Hebrew and Yiddish reading culture and circulation. So let me say just a few words about Modern Hebrew and Yiddish Literatures, or Jewish Literary Modernity, as I have it in the title. And I want to talk about Jewish literary modernity essentially because I don't really know what it means. There's a general sense in the subfields of modern Jewish literatures that we know what literary modernity looks like, that we know how to characterize it, when or where it starts, generally speaking, that there's or that we know, moreover, that where liturgy ends and modern poetry begins, or how to differentiate hagiography or folk narrative from the novel. There's also a sense that we know the rise of literary modernity to be a good thing. Some of us might like to celebrate it, perhaps, to celebrate the fact that European Jews developed modern literature, and that literature, in sort of a circular way, has succeeded in making them, the Jews that is, in fact, modern people. But the more I read in the Yiddish and Hebrew textual worlds, precisely at the time when those two literatures are said to emerge and crystallize into modern literary canons, which is at the late 19th century and early 20th century, the less I feel like I know what that literary modernity is. I'm not alone in this. In fact, I'm thinking with scholars across the varied fields of Jewish studies, some of them are sitting in this very room, who have been contemplating the hybrid nature of Jewish modernization, challenging its the Eurocentric character of this narrative, the scholarly narrative, or questioning its misleading linearity from religion to secularity, proposing instead intricate and nuanced analyses of, for example, the emergence of Jewish scientific knowledge and historical thinking, or of the heterogeneous qualities of the Jewish Enlightenment vis-a-vis its contemporary Hasidism. And so, I've come to think that the singularity and weight of terms like literature and modern has obscured some of the ways that textual production in this period is situated within a sprawling set of cultural practices. And these terms encourage us to overlook some of the most widely circulated books of the period. Those range from sentimentalist poetry that blends liturgy and nationalist discourse together with sensibilities of popular fiction, such as eroticism and romance, through historical works that share an intimacy with the Gothic, historical fiction, hagiography, and folk narrative, to works of popular science in which geography, folk medicine, fantasy, theology, cosmology are indistinguishable from one another. While these books were instrumental in cultivating a mass Jewish readership and in instilling in Jewish readers certain expectations and interpretive intuitions, they remain on the margins of how scholars think of Hebrew and Yiddish literary canons. And so this newness or modernity of modern Hebrew or modern Yiddish literature is a primary question that my project is invested in, not in an aspiration to define literary modernity better so that we can speak about it more convincingly, but so that we can perhaps consider putting those labels aside. So the manuscript that I'm working on that's called Bad Readers, advances two somewhat contradictory arguments in this regard. First, that writers and intellectuals writing in Hebrew and Yiddish in the 19th and early 20th centuries aimed to produce what they understood as a modern literary canon, and that they did so in order to advance their modernizing or nationalizing agendas through a sort of a literary civilization mission targeted at the Jews of Eastern Europe, conditioning them to adhere to rules of literary propriety. Different genres should be read, should be approached differently. You're not supposed to read an instruction manual for piety or for devotion, or liturgy for pleasure, or pulp fiction in order to edify yourself. One must read in a chronological order. The text is a totality and should be engaged with as such. Selective reading is prohibited. Physical books should be treated a certain way and not another way, and so on. But these are emergent norms promoted by various actors, writers, publishers, translators, editors, librarians, and this is what guides the second argument. So against all of these emergent norms, readers always remain free agents. They do with texts as they wish. And so my project is devoted to highlighting all the ways in which both readers and writers defied these rules and these demands to modernize, to Europeanize, to enlighten, and to nationalize through literature. They misread, they mistranslated, they read selectively and out of order, they plagiarized, copied, vandalized, and they found pleasure where they weren't supposed to. Such acts of literary impropriety or textual malpractice, as I think of them in this project, are rebellious and revolutionary, iconoclastic as much as they are creative. And they are therefore productive for me because they reveal the force of textual instability and multiplicity, and they allow us to retell the stories of Yiddish and Hebrew writing as a nonlinear and ever-shifting story, beyond historiographic narratives that focus on the national collective or on European modernization as an ultimate explanatory framework and the foundation for that supposed Jewish literary modernity. What I'd like to argue today, though, is that textual depictions of anti-Jewish violence and horrific death are particularly helpful, bear with me, in thinking about moments of textual failure and instability. First, because they alert us to crises and incoherence. I imagine that I'm not alone in this room in feeling particularly acutely right now that violence truly works in the sense that it does succeed in precluding possibilities to speak, that it truly shatters the foundations of language. And so it is helpful to think about the incommensurability, the untranslatability, and the heterogeneity of the literary text precisely by focusing on generative moments of semiotic and material collapse. And secondly, and along similar lines, there's a particular contradiction, which I'm still trying to define better, at the very foundation of literature on the catastrophe, literature on the calamity. And it's something about the merging together of pleasure and horror, or pleasure and violence, in the aesthetic enterprise of the literature about the calamity. And that this kind of contradiction is, again, productive for me in questioning the stability of categories such as literature or literary modernity and so on. And so while the works that Moshe Aaron Lev, that I'll now soon return to, while these works, chiefly Shevet Yehuda and Yeven Metzula, have served as the basis for scholarship on Jewish commemoration practices, and I'm thinking here with Yerushalmi's seminal work Zachor, or Mintz's Churban that Eva mentioned before, what I would like to do in my exploration of these works on the catastrophe is to reassess their vast popularity and circulation among Jewish audiences in order to learn what they might tell us about Jewish reading cultures, sort of beyond that interpretive prospect of thinking about commemoration. So with this in mind, I want to return to Moshe Aaron and the volume that he read, which I think of as a useful index into textual malpractices that open the door for these new stories about Hebrew and Yiddish literature at their formative moment. So where the Russian monarchy is mentioned, Moshe Aaron either strikes through the text or adds a comment on the margin, where the editor of the compilation blesses the Russian monarchy and praises Russian Jews' loyalty to the crown. Moshe Aaron got really angry and began crisscrossing the entire page. You see that on the right. With his pencil, so it's a very mild form of vandalism, erasable, but it's still there. On the opposite page, next to a mention of Tsar Nikolai II, Moshe Aaron wrote passionately, Yimach Shmoi v'zichroi ufgerissen werden, er soll von das Land Russland kein Zecher bleiben nicht, or may his name be blotted out, may it be torn apart, may there remain no trace of that country, Russia. Moshe Aaron then, exactly. Yes. If you'd like to substitute Nikolai II for another Russian leader, you'd be very welcome. I have a specific name in mind. Moshe Aaron then addressed future readers of that volume, which I remind you he borrowed from a circulating library, and this is at the bottom of the page down there. He's saying, Les nicht dem falschen Buch, verbrennt es. Do not read this erroneous book, burn it. But rather than burning it, however, he ended up returning the book to the library. But before doing so, however, he became a little more creative, and in another page where the editor mentions Jews' loyalty to Russia, he struck through the word Russia, Russland, and wrote in England instead. And I'll remind you that he immigrated to London. And finally, where the text related to the Kaiser, i.e. To Tsar or Emperor Nikolai II, Moshe Aaron changed the letters Kof and Yod to a Chet and added an Ayin instead, thus spelling out, or in fact misspelling, the word Chazer, so the Kaiser Chazer, pig or swine, to describe that Kaiser that the text refers to as Yirum Hoido, or may his majesty be exalted. So the question is, or that's my question for today, is if and how Moshe Aaron's acts of vandalism is helpful for us analytically. I want to argue that it alerts us to several interesting and generative points of incoherence in Yeven Metzulah, the text that he read, and in its publication history, and that the map of textual malpractices that this publication history illustrates may help us in charting the rebellious and liberatory prospects in the reading culture that developed around such texts on the Catastrophe. So to start, if you are somewhat familiar with the text of Yeven Metzulah, you were probably surprised to hear that Moshe Aaron encountered mentions of the Russian Tsardom while reading it, and you'd be, of course, obviously correct, because the 17th century chronicle doesn't mention the Tsars, most obviously not Nikolai II, last emperor of the Russian Empire, for whom, I should note, Yiddish speakers reserved many juicier swears than Chazer. The version that Moshe Aaron read exemplifies a phenomenon pervasive throughout the publication history of Yeven Metzulah of mistranslations, partial translations, and very liberal translations into Yiddish, as well as abridged, excerpted, and edited transmission in the Hebrew editions. The first full Yiddish translation appeared only in the 1920s, and all the Yiddish renditions that preceded it offered significant variations on the Hebrew text, and I have here just a few. There are a few more Yiddish translations prior to that 1921. But all of these are essentially not really a translation, but a very free rendition, including versions in verse and in rhyme. The Hebrew original is not in verse and in rhyme. Extremely selective translations and significant additions to Hanover's narrative that tended to emphasize the most graphic and gruesome parts of the text, as well as its more marginal messianic currents. The rendition that Moshe Aaron read was based on an earlier translation by the mid-19th century Maskilic and sentimentalist writer Isaac Mayer Dick, who in this translation demonstrated his characteristic merger of traditionalist values together with liberal hopes for a Jewish social and political integration into the Russian Empire under the liberal reforms of Tsar Alexander II. In the edition that Moshe Aaron read, the mentions of Alexander II were replaced with a contemporary Nikolai II by the volume's editor, Yoshua Mezach, a Maskil educator and writer himself of dozens of popular works that were published in the format of a cheap chapbook, which is a genre that enjoyed a great boom in the late 19th century, known in Yiddish as Bichelech, or Heften. His version of Shevet Yehuda shares very little with the 16th century historiographic work, adding to it additional partial translations of other works alongside Hanover's Yeven Metzulah, including a reworking of a Crusader narrative, short texts of popular science, botany, astronomy, and folk medicine. So it's, this anthology, or perhaps we should say this textual mishmash, showcases a belated Maskilic project at the turn of the 20th century, advocating loyalty to the Tsars, just as the empire was crumbling and when imperial loyalist attitudes among Jews, especially the Jewish youth to whom this anthology was dedicated, were crashing. And I'll note that this edition, the edition that Moshe Aaron read, was published in 1904, a year after the Kishinev pogrom. So this attempt to draw the Jewish youth to some kind of a Tsarist loyalism is at that point just an absurdity. But Mezach's choppy anthology isn't the only disorderly compilation here. Yeven Metzulah is itself an amalgamation of genres, topics, and textual modes and moods. It incorporates what seems to modern readers like distinctly different genres or textual modes. We find in it theological discussions, hagiography, and historical political contemplations about the Kingdom of Poland's feudal regime and of the Jews' economic role in it. And alongside these contemplations, it also includes extremely graphic and gruesome descriptions of violence, torture, and revenge. I ask you to excuse this anachronistic depiction, which betrays, of course, an expectation by a modern reader, that is myself, an expectation of a certain coherence and generic uniformity that I pose to this 17th century chronicle. I note these diverging genres in Hanover's text, however, not as a critique of the text or in search for ways to understand how the conflicting parts, in fact, live together in harmony in this work. I ask instead what such moments of incoherence and dissonance can tell us about the reading culture that evolved around texts like Yeven Metzula. In other words, what happens to a reader when one encounters that diversity and heterogeneity of literary modes or textual modes. The heterogeneity of the chronicle, I believe, summoned diverging reading possibilities, and these divergent reading modes, I argue, are what allowed Moshe Aaron Lev to engage creatively and iconoclastically with Hanover's text. So in the physical copies that show significant evidence of readerly use among the several dozen copies which I was able to consult, a clear pattern emerges in this sense in asking how readers actually engage with the different genres that live together in that work. And that clear pattern is that the pages whose contents belong to the most graphic depictions of brutality and to the most gripping plot lines of betrayal, revenge, and cunning battle tactics exhibit the heaviest and most consistent use by readers. By this I mean that these pages show more markings on the margins, significantly more wear and tear, spill stains, oxidation and discoloration, tatter, and in a few cases, some of these pages are missing entirely and have been either intentionally torn out of the book or have disconnected from the binding due to repeated use. The least used pages all belong to Hanover's historical analyses and theological discussions. And here, this is just to illustrate to you what use looks like in some of these volumes. So this pattern also mirrors choices made by publishers of the Hebrew editions as well as Yiddish translators. In almost all the abridged versions, the transmitters skipped the historical explanations and theological debates in favor of an emphasis on the graphic and sensational parts. The various publications of Yeven Metzula encourage, therefore, their readers to read it non-linearly and selectively. They also give us a sense that this work was circulated not only for its role in commemorating the Jewish tragedy of the 17th century in Ukraine, but also for its fictional qualities, or as a work suited not only for devotional or instructive reading, but as a pastime activity, alongside other emergent forms of reading for entertainment and pleasure that enjoyed a great boom in the late 19th century. And I want to note that this is in centimeters, how tiny these are and how they do participate in terms of their formal aspects in that culture of reading for pleasure, for entertainment, and cheap publishing norms. The publisher of the volume that Moshe Aaron read recognized just that anti-Jewish brutality sells really well. And he saw Hanover's work as one that can and should be marketed alongside works by the most sensationalist contemporary Yiddish writer of pulp fiction, Nochem Meir Shaikevich, also known as Shomer, as well as some of Shomer's many emulators in the booming market of Yiddish chapbook. So these are, at the end of the volume, he attaches these advertisements. So if you're the reader of Sefer Shevet Yehuda Shalem, or of that translation of Yeven Metzula, then presumably you're also interested in these items that the publisher has for sale. The last direction that I'd like to explore through Moshe Aaron's copy is that in his vandalism, he turned the library book into a site of unsanctioned communication when another reader followed suit in signing his name. I'm a really bad reader of a Latin script, but it seems to me like this is one name, yeah? Solomon Goldberg? I don't know. Okay. Yeah, okay. So for some reason, Solomon Goldberg signed twice. Maybe he wasn't sure if we're going to get it. More readers followed him as well in offering their own version, their own form of vandalism against the text. And so here is an example of another reader who did their vandalism with a pen. So it's a different pen than Moshe Allen's pencil. And that's on the left. And on the right, it's a different tactic of vandalism. Rather than crossing over the word, the vandalists, the vandal, how do you say, like scratched off the ink from the page. The physical book, in other words, became a site in which animosity towards the book's producers was exchanged in expansive, infectious acts of vandalism. That communication, however, was not free from interruption. On the other side of the page where Moshe Allen and then Solomon Goldberg signed their names, the London East End Jewish Lending Library attached a page detailing its bylaws. So here it is. So of course, one, I'm not going to read it because I don't have time, but the item on protection of books, obviously the library professionals could not have rewarded Moshe Allen for his acts of vandalism. But I want to read, I'm thinking about specifically the second item that I have here quoted, infectious diseases. So persons suffering from infectious disease shall not borrow, read, or in any way use books belonging to the library. Readers are required to report at once to the superintendent whenever infectious diseases occur in their homes, and to deliver all library books in their possession to the local public health authorities of the borough, also to obtain a receipt for all volumes so surrendered and deliver it to the superintendent. So I was reading it as, sort of in the last days of COVID lockdown, so that was particularly meaningful. But this passage also brings me to think about the physical book as a potential carrier of disease. Or in other words, I want to say it is a carrier of social and political anxieties. By this statement, I follow Natalie Zimon Davis' suggestion that, quote, we consider a printed book not merely as a source for ideas and images, but as a carrier of relationships. The physical book highlights the tension between, on the one hand, how producers of books, writers, translators, publishers, think of the book's content in abstract terms, as encompassing a certain set of ideas, as something universally understood and equally perceived by any reader, never confined to the boundaries of its physical circulation. And on the other hand, the fact that readers always read text through their material manifestation, whether in book form or not, and that their reading is always tainted, figuratively and literally, by context and social attachments. As Roger Chartier put it, quote, authors do not write books, they write texts that become written objects. The space between text and object, which is precisely the space in which meaning is constructed, has too often been forgotten. So what would it mean, what would it look like to think about the book as object rather than text? What is essential, writes Chartier, is, quote, to understand how the same text can be differently apprehended, manipulated, and comprehended, end quote. So the physical book, in other words, turns our attention to the fact that readers, and especially bad readers like Moshe Allen Lev, can approach the same text in myriad ways, following their producers' intentions, sidestepping them, or actively rebelling against them in ways that are creative and imaginative as much as they are iconoclastic and vandalistic. Library bylaws may mandate quarantines for books in an attempt to assuage such anxieties about the physical book, but readers have and always will do with books as they wish. While literary scholarship tends to triumphantly attribute to literature the power to edify, to modernize, to enlighten, Moshe Allen's copy alerts us to moments of rebellion, vandalism, misuses of the text, or in other words, to moments of bad reading and textual malpractice. Cases of textual malpractice mark the history of Yeven Metzula and its circulation throughout. Both transmitters and readers of the text have engaged excessively in practices discouraged by emergent norms of modern European textuality, in its abridged and mistranslated versions, and in its varying physical form as a cultural artifact from an object of ritual and devotion to ephemera and objects of popular culture, Yeven Metzula's circulation history encourages a reading culture of distraction that allowed readers to appropriate it for their own ends. From a readerly point of view, Yeven Metzula thus appears before us as a fundamentally heterogeneous text, unclassifiable as highbrow or lowbrow, defying reified distinctions between Hebrew and Yiddish, and blurring the lines between the literary, historiographic, devotional, fictional, or sentimental. It alerts us to crucial moments in the emergence of modern Jewish textual culture, precisely through its generic incoherence and its incongruity with notions of modern European textuality. As a text about the catastrophe, its circulation history teaches us not only about Jewish modes of commemorating loss and tragic death, but also about the dynamic, lively cultural force of textual failure, collapse, and malpractice.